Good morning. I'm Ellen Richstone, and I'm a board member and the chair of the NACD New England Programming Committee. Thank you for joining us for our virtual program, Governing for the Future, the Impact of Geopolitics on Global Business Strategy. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event to submit questions. We will monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse the questions as they come up. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits for this program. To receive credit, we need to know your first and last name. Please make sure that your full name is visible in your Zoom window. If you are on this call via phone, send an email to Deb Rosenthal so you receive credit. Finally, the panelists and moderator statements and opinions are their own and not the companies for which they work. I would, of course, be remiss if I did not thank all of our chapter sponsors. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors. It is their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric, local programming and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that is vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. Today, we are highlighting two very special spotlight sponsors, PwC and Protiviti, who have continued to support our mission of excellent corporate governance. Thank you for your support. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Sandy Moose. Sandy's career was with the Boston Consulting Group, where she was a senior managing partner and director. She was the first woman hired by BCG and the first in the management consulting industry. In the course of her tenure, she headed BCG's New York City office and co-founded the financial services practice. She is still affiliated with BCG as an outside senior advisor. She also has had a second career serving on corporate as well as nonprofit boards. Most notably, she was the first lead director of Verizon Communications, and in the nonprofit space, she was the first woman to chair the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in New York and president of the Board of Trustees of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I will now turn it over to Sandy. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Ellen, for your very kind words. It was very thoughtful of you. I'm delighted to be here and pleased to introduce today's speaker, Bhaskar Chakravorti. Bhaskar is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and he is also the founding executive director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in the Global Context, and he's founder and chair of Digital Planet, one of Fletcher's flagship research programs that studies the impact of technology on the lives and livelihoods of people around the world. He is the creator of the widely used Digital Evolution Index and the author of the best-selling book, The Slow Pace of Fast Change, Bringing Innovations to Market in a Connected World. In the interest of time, I will not be able to give due justice to Bhaskar's impressive resume with his long list of accomplishments and credentials, which you can read in the NACD materials for this session. Bhaskar, it would be great if you could take roughly 15 minutes to talk about the geopolitical changes that have occurred in the past year or so. Then we can open it up to a discussion about implications for boards of directors. I will follow up with some questions along two avenues. One is the substance of some of the issues in the context of boards making decisions on business strategy. And second, some process implications. How should directors think about these issues and become knowledgeable in advance of board meetings? And what are some implications for the board's role and any changes in their traditional role in light of these issues? So I'll come back to those two avenues of questions, but Bhaskar, we look forward to your remarks. And thank you for being with us this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for having me. join this incredible group, and I'm deeply grateful to Ellen and the entire organization at NACD for organizing this event. I'm just to declare at the outset, I'm looking to learn as much as I can, put into the pot here, because no single person has a read on the convergence of issues that are in front of us. I mean, every day we wake up and wonder, how much more complicated can the world get? And then you open, your screen or your old-fashioned newspaper, and sure enough, something else has kind of hit the radar, and continues to just make our world so much more complicated than we can ever remember. And what I can see across this group that is assembled here is a tremendous body of experience. So we're not talking about people who haven't seen complex environments and a complex geopolitical order in earlier times. So I'm before I lead off with my observations and some preliminary comments to get us going, I'd love to have everybody put in their chat, what they consider to be the top geopolitical issue that is affecting the organizations that they're connected with, either their own or organizations with which they're on the boards of, or with which they do business. So if you could just enter it in the chat, I think it'll be helpful to get a sense of where people's minds are. And I'll give it 30 seconds really, and then let's have a conversation. So I can see decline of democracy. All right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big one. Supply chain predictability, income inequality, privacy, lack of training of leadership, energy. There's decline of democracy once again. Ukraine, inflation, offshoring, conflicts, instability, supply chain, democracy, regional wars. Okay. Interest rates and economic instability, unemployment, Middle East. All right. I think we can see a theme here. There is uncertainty and risk all around, and coming from a variety of different angles. There are inescapably, there's conflict around the world. There is conflict in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, a fear of conflict in the straits, surrounding China and Taiwan, and conflict right here at home within the United States. And when one talks about decline of democracy, that's tied to the concerns around the deep division which exists, right here in the country. And then, of course, who can forget that we are just closing out the year 2023, and it's not been that long that we all kind of got plunged into a pandemic, and the after effects of the pandemic are still with us. And many of the issues that several of you noted, whether that has to do with supply chain disruptions, inflation, the impact of employees' well-being, which also is affected by conflict around the world. But employees' well-being is also tied to the after effects of the pandemic, and this is something that several of us were talking about before everybody joined, which is what's the state of the organizational well-being as companies and organizations everywhere are trying to figure out the new equilibrium of work, and how people are trying to understand, where work can be done, and what's the best way to, strike a balance between having everybody, within a proximate location, or giving people the freedom to just be anywhere. And all of this is sort of interconnected, of course, as we think about, just consider one example of interconnectedness. And I'm just going to pick one of the themes that, of the many that all of you have contributed. Let's talk about the theme of inflation. We normally don't think about inflation as a geopolitical issue, right? I mean, inflation is something that the Federal Reserve and the economists, worry about, and they, help us sort of think through the different levers with which, governments and other entities can deal with inflation. But we try to understand the underlying drivers behind the inflationary pressures that had existed. And by the way, we are now seeing a moment where some of those pressures are easing, and certainly there seems to be, at least where we are today, a certain amount of good news. But if you think about where inflation is coming from, there are so many different factors that are converging to create those inflationary pressures, not the least of which being the pandemic and all the elements that were tied together with the pandemic. And who can forget, most of us will remember where we were in March 2020 when, essentially a lockdown was declared, and then how life unfolded afterwards. But who can forget that image of the ship stuck in the Suez Canal, almost as the lasting visual memory of bottlenecks. And of course, that ship alone was not responsible for the many bottlenecks that we experienced all around the world, but it was a visual reminder of how critically dependent we are on the transportation of goods and services and people and data and money, all around this globalized world. And the moment there is a major breakdown in that almost seamless connectivity that we had become used to and basically had become so comfortable with, the entire system just gets not just jammed up, but we can feel the ripple effect. So a large part of the inflationary pressures started coming from the supply chain breakdowns. And then, of course, we had more challenges that started piling up. And it was a combination of a war in a very critical part of the world, a war, right there in Europe, a war that involved a significant, nuclear power, a war that involved a country that was on the borders of NATO, and a war that almost simultaneously affected so many different industries, and most significantly, the food and agriculture sector. And suffice it to say that those two elements alone could explain a large part of the inflationary pressures. But of course, we know there's so much more going on. Now, as that war, and as I'm just talking about the conflict in Ukraine, and of course, we know that there are more wars that have broken out since then. But as we sort of think about the ripple effects of the war and the impact that it has not just on food and ag, or with the geopolitical equilibrium that the West had reached with Russia, there is also a parallel effect of concerns around the West and the rest of the world's relationship with the major economic and military superpower of the 21st century, which is China, and concerns about whether the war in Ukraine might actually lead to an increase in tensions in a very different part of the world that continue to deepen the rift, particularly between the United States and China. And as we think about all the supply chain problems that we had coming out of the pandemic, those issues, at least from a risk perspective, could stand to get only worse, because China is such an important part of the global supply chain in practically every industry anywhere. So we can see how these topics that each one of you raised, and I gave you a very difficult assignment, of all these topics, name one. What's on the top of the list? But of course, we know that is not an accurate way to think about the geopolitical challenges that we face, not just as a global society, but as organizations, that these issues are interconnected. So if I pull any single thread, from the many that you presented, the fabric starts coming apart from many different parts of the entire surface area. So when I pull the inflationary thread, I start seeing the connections, across all the other topics that each one of you have put out. So when if one were to even take a vote of, what's the most significant geopolitical issue that's affecting us today, it's really difficult to kind of say, okay, this is number one, because these issues really are not just interconnected, but there's a systemic element to all of this. Now, of course, as we explore the challenges relating to conflict, global health, the impact on the seamless movement of goods and services and data and money and people across political borders, we are also concerned about the state of politics around the world. So as we think about the wars beyond our borders being right here in the United States, we are increasingly concerned about the wars within our borders. And when we think about those wars also have dimensions that are perhaps, we've seen them before, we've seen variants of them before, but in so many ways, they are just plain new. Now, just recently, Vice President Kamala Harris broke a record of essentially breaking more ties in Congress than any other vice president in history. And it points to and she did this in a period of essentially 3 years that this administration has been in power, and that rate of tie breaking by a vice president in such a short time has never happened in American history. Now, the reason why I just pull out that one indicator of many that we can talk about is that it just is suggestive of the deep deep divide and polarization even within the Houses of Congress, and a reflection of the polarization that we experience across the country. And when we think about those wars, and hopefully it does not translate into the kind of war that we lived through before our time, but certainly we read about in the history books, or the Civil War. There is a virtual civil war in going on in so many dimensions. And to compound the political divide, we have, of course, unprecedented forms of kind of candidates, who are now the most prominent ones at the head of these political divides. So on the one hand, you have the leading candidate on the Republican side, who is facing more indictments than one can even keep track of as we kind of go forward. On the other hand, we have the leading candidate on the Democratic side, who is the oldest sitting president in American history. And if this wasn't already a highly divided and divisive set of issues that are separating the two major political parties, the conflict in the Middle East has created additional rifts within each of those camps themselves. So as one thinks about the divisions, there is almost like a fractal nature, which is every time I go through the divide and go to one side of the divide, I see another crack opening up within them as well. So when one says that the United States has broken out into this bipolar nation, is actually much more than bipolar. We've become multipolar, and those divisions are not there just on the left; it's there on the right as well. So as one thinks about these deep divisions, now we have yet another factor that we are grappling with, which is the emergence of information as a critical participant in our political, economic, and social discourse. And that state of information, of course, has been with us ever since this thing called the internet has been with us since the early to mid 90s. But just in the last year itself, there has just been this absolute mania about artificial intelligence as being this still incomprehensible movement in technology that has the potential to disrupt and has the potential to really transform in a very positive way lives and livelihoods of people all around the world. And even the experts in the field are trying to figure this out. And if the experts in the field are trying to figure this out, our public leaders, regulators, those who think about these issues from a global perspective, they are almost sitting by the sidelines, waiting for the experts to somehow, sort this out. And there seems to be an enormous amount of confusion just in that technology space alone. Even before artificial intelligence sort of brought this new cloud of both confusion and excitement to the larger discourse, political, social, and business discourse, we had a whole set of concerns around where technology itself was taking us. Now, technology, of course, has increasingly been a growing part of our lives, and the internet has been a powerful mechanism for connection and communication, and that had simply been growing exponentially in ways that are very, very exciting and transformational from the perspective of business and social connectivity. But then we started, particularly after the elections of 2006, we began to start getting concerned about the role that technology and social media and the movement of information unmediated by any institution, what that might do to our understanding of the world and our understanding of the political positions and the social positions and the business positions of individuals all around. And the state of disinformation, the state of governance of data, all of this has remained unresolved. And now we have artificial intelligence and all the unresolved aspects of that sitting on top of previously unresolved issues. So many of you noted concerns around data privacy, for instance, which we still haven't been able to figure out. Some of you noted the state of disinformation as being something that you're deeply worried about. We still haven't figured all this out. And of course, along comes this new wave of technology, which is adding to the complexity. So there is just so much to process on any given day today. And it's not, the issues don't seem to be heading towards resolution. They seem to be, getting more and more complex and more interwoven. So that theme that I noted earlier, which is you pull one thread and the entire fabric starts looking vulnerable, that theme is getting deeper as we look ahead. So as we sort of step back and kind of say, what do we do about this? Of course, each one of us, is in some capacity of responsibility, and you have some sphere of influence, but our influence as individuals or even as organizations is limited. So it's important to, first of all, understand what are all these issues that are, that have the deepest impact in the world around us, and suffice it to say that we do need to be aware of these issues at a global level, even if one is sitting in an organization whose orbit is relatively local, because there is almost nothing that is local these days. Everything is interconnected from a geographic perspective, and as I have said many times before, everything is interconnected from an issue perspective. But then one asks the question, what can each one of us do? And I think this is a theme that, Sandy, we will return to as we, get into our conversation, which is that all of you are in positions of responsibility in your individual organizations and also as directors, as board directors in several other organizations. And even if you're not in a formal capacity, you are in some kind of a leadership and advisory capacity in other places. Now, so much of leadership has been focused on organizational questions or has been focused on giving people inspiration, a sense of vision, a sense of direction, and often the role of board members has been, the needle has moved quite significantly towards having board members play an oversight role, a role of essentially helping organizations comply with rules and regulations or ethical frameworks. These are all important roles for leaders and board directors. But now there is a very, very important role that each one of you and each one of us needs to step into, which is the role of being advisors, being those who bring an element of what I would call contextual intelligence into the boardroom. And not just into the boardroom, but into the cafeteria where you might be, sitting with your coworkers, or in a Zoom conversation. And when one talks about contextual intelligence, it is all that stuff that sits in the perimeter of your organization, which seems to be somehow outside the boundaries of your organization. But when one thinks about it, they have an enormous role to play in the decisions within your organization. And invariably, whenever we see somebody, make a presentation, present a business case for a new idea or an investment proposition, they talk about some of those perimeter issues, but usually those perimeter issues are stuck in appendices B, C, D, and E as, political risk or, alternative scenarios kind of thing. My call to action is to bring those appendices to the front, to integrate that appendix thinking, that contextual thinking, all these issues, whether it has to do with inflation, whether it has to do with conflict in different parts of the world, whether it has to do with supply chain disruptions, whether it has to do with uncertainties around China and Taiwan, whether it has to do with the role of technology. And of course, there's another huge honking issue that I haven't even talked about, which is a huge miss on my part, and I'm going to note it, and then we'll get into a conversation. And that huge issue is the climate. And of course, there is a COP meeting going on right now in the UAE. We know that the meeting is going to produce some kind of a memorandum, and that memorandum is largely going to be to agree to have more memoranda down the road. And in the meantime, the Earth is looking at some pretty serious dangers almost on a daily basis, and and we're experiencing it in practically every part of the world. And when one thinks about the impact of climate, it affects everything. It affects everything simply because of the environmental and planetary nature, which are just inescapable no matter where we are. So when we go back to issues of inflation or conflict or food insecurity or supply chain disruptions, or even data and AI related concerns, all of that could get tied back into climate, because climate affects everything. And ultimately, climate affects health, and climate affects our current generations and the generations to come. So that's a lot to process. And as one thinks about all those different elements, that is the context that I'm talking about. It is not just local context, it's global context. And of course, people often say context is everything. In this context is indeed everything. And unfortunately, much of our education system and our organizational systems force us to become specialists, force us to become relatively narrow, because that's how we stay ahead, that's how we stay competitive, that's how we stay on the edge. And a victim of that specialization is our contextual intelligence. And I really believe that it's all of that peripheral vision that the board, that senior advisors, that senior leaders can bring back into organizations. And I'd like that to be, perhaps a theme that we can potentially walk away with as we, go through this discussion and think about the so whats as we, look at life beyond this. So I know this has been a bit of a meandering, coverage of, many different issues. I'm happy to dive deep into any single one of them or any subset of them. There's a lot to talk about, and I will pause here. And Sandy, let's have a chat. And of course, I'd love to hear from all of you, as you're experiencing this context and these issues in your own endeavors, and let's have a conversation around how you're seeing that as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Bhaskar, these are all wonderful comments. And I want to make sure that we spend a lot of time on this, thinking of an advisory role for the board and maybe moving the needle more from compliance to advisory board, and your whole notion of contextual context, and contextual intelligence, and how do board members bring that to bear, and also what kinds of skills are needed. But I know there were a lot of questions to begin with on the supply chain, so perhaps we might delve into some of the substantive issues and then move to the process of how boards deal with them. And one of the ones, as they say, supply chain and potential impacts of these geopolitical shifts. You know, the ability to split up supply chain through the advances in IT and communication really enabled globalization. But with nationalization, this can now fall apart. So, for example, I've been involved with a power generation company which can no longer use low-cost panels made in China, despite, as you were talking about, the climate imperative, despite an ESG imperative to move to renewables. So how is this issue of nationalization likely to play out on global supply chain? And how does that impact the way the company envisions its strategy and the investment decisions? And, you know, there's a question in the chat that maybe we can draw in here, is that how do you incorporate those geopolitical elements into the enterprise risk management as you make decisions on supply chain, given the kind of conflicts around the world?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and such a difficult question to, you know, sort of tease apart, right? So as you rightly noted, Sandy, there has been a push towards, you know, I won't exactly call it anti-globalization. I think there is a pause and a rethink about unfettered globalization, and both governments and organizations are kind of wondering whether we have just gone too far, and how do we pull back in, you know, the different elements of our supply chains and other parts of the value chains of our individual organizations, so that we have a little bit more control, a little bit less reliance on parties that might be sitting on global geopolitical fault lines, and how do we also have greater visibility into what's happening in our supply chains, because there is a greater interest and potentially demand from investors and other parties, other stakeholders, to be compliant with various principles, whether you call it ESG or you know, other kinds of principles. There are, you know, all kinds of pressures that are bearing down on organizations. So as we sort of think about that from an organizational perspective, of course, every company and every industry is trying to come up with you know, make its own piece with that. And I hate the term anti-globalization, because I don't think there is anything anti about it. This is the nature of markets, where we are going to be seeking, you know, the most efficient sourcing of you know, inputs into our products, and that efficiency has to do with it's a combination of cost and timing and quality, and there is no reason why that sourcing has to sit within a particular set of political borders. And taking a step into the unknown and taking risks is invariably a part of any company and industry's competitive strategy. So no choice that a company makes is ever risk-free. It's always a question of, you know, how one assesses the risks, and how does that you know, present a trade-off with the benefits of being able to, you know, spread out your supply chains. So as we think about these issues, I will just layer one more challenge, which the pandemic actually made us aware of, which was that pre-pandemic, there had always been this mantra of hyper-efficient organizations of supply chains. Everything was going to be just in time. Everything was going to be, you know, informed by increasing availability of data and analytics, and because of our the enormous amount of faith that we put into the information technology systems, we felt that you know, we could really fine-tune the supply chain and the contracts and agreements agreements that we had with participants all around the world. And of course, all that fine-tuning went out the window once the pandemic arrived and people realized that we should have built in redundancies. So I think a combination of pandemic, global conflict, concerns about certainly some of the major countries that have been part of the globalized supply chain, such as China, and the emergence of other parts of the world, in particular, if I'm thinking about countries like Vietnam or countries like India, or even some other, countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, which, largely at least for American organizations, had sort of been on the periphery because there was so much attention paid to China. There was so much attention paid to individual countries in in Asia or in Europe that now some of these other elements are sort of coming into view. People are sort of rethinking the original concept of what constitutes the right way to organize one's supply chain. I think in addition to the individual organizational and industry discussions, we cannot escape the fact that our governments are also making decisions for us. So in particular, let's look at the example of the US government, really kind of taking a fairly strong line on China, on many aspects of doing business with China. We're already, living in a world with lots of constraints and sanctions on several other parties around the world. And as private sector organizations or social sector organizations comply with the constraints that the U.S. government itself, puts on us, you kind of have to think about, okay, how much of this, can we now bring back onshore or close to shore in order to both comply with the constraints and minimize the risks and lack of control. I think we are going to see a degree of reversal that has already been happening, and as we look ahead, there are a few things that I would ask each one of us to consider. One is that the market ultimately always wins. The market ultimately always wins. So you might pull back, you might move your a portion of your supply chain from China to back here in the United States or to Mexico or Canada, or you might choose a China plus one strategy, which is kind of saying, well, I'm not going to be entirely dependent on this one source. I'm going to go to Vietnam, or I'm going to go to India, or I'm going to go to Ethiopia. You might be doing all of that in response to some of the near-term pressures, but ultimately the competitiveness of any given market is going to start kicking in. So the moment you do that, you realize that you are going to be adding on a degree of costs, a degree of inefficiency, a degree of friction in your supply chains. And the moment you add that element of friction and cost, that creates an opening for a competitor to do exactly a very different strategy. And the different strategy could be back to what we did before the pandemic, back to what we did before Ukraine, back to what we did before, the last geopolitical issue that caused us to rethink these things. And the reason why, we should expect that is because we went into this phase of unfettered globalization because it paid off, because companies did see value in essentially spreading out their supply chains, further out and faster. The other factor that is playing a major role is technology. Now, a large part of this fragmentation and spreading out of supply chain was enabled by the fact that we had access to all this data. We had access to so much technology that was, giving us a sense of, much greater control over this globally dispersed system. That technology is only going to get better. And it is getting better as we speak. And literally the arrival of, not just better data systems, but also AI and many applications of AI is just going to empower more people to kind of say, well, here's one way in which I can potentially keep many of those uncertainties and risks under my control. Now, I'll say one more thing and then pause because I've sort of been on a run for a while. The other thing that is likely to happen is many of the services and physical elements that used to be in our supply chains could go virtual. And they could go virtual because of the introduction of automation, and AI will displace some traditional elements of our supply chains. These could be, for instance, call centers, or it could be customer service systems, or it could be some kind of a partner that you've had, which then gets displaced by the rapid advances of new forms of technology. So just to kind of summarize, I don't think there is any such thing as anti-globalization. That's not going to happen. There is going to be a rethink on globalization. And as each one of us as individuals start doing a little bit of rethinking, the market is going to push us back again in the opposite direction. Technology is going to push us into a new direction, which we may not even have explored so far. So those are the two forces that I would keep an eye out for as we think about the state of supply chains going forward. And by the way, one more thing, just keep in mind, yes, we are on the other side of the pandemic tunnel. Not only is there light, there is daylight. We're walking in sunshine, but the next pandemic is potentially just around the corner. One lesson that we have learned through the experience of 2020 is that, all those dangers that people have spoken about in the past, we shouldn't be ignoring them. We should be looking out for these tiny little signals that keep coming at us and figuring out how to sort through them and keep an eye out for them. So a major catastrophe like that, could revisit us, and we need to be prepared to at least think about, okay, how do we pretty rapidly adjust and adapt? Something that we failed to do in 2020.
Well, thank you very much. I think you covered a lot of points, and I think you've hit on some of the questions that were in the chat. But I think I would like to make sure we have time to go into the advisory role and talking about contextual intelligence, because as one of the questions come out, the victim of specialization is a contextual intelligence. And how is it that boards can bring that to bear and be comfortable as advisors? But I want to ask just one more question, picking up on your market point and markets winning. And that is, what about the role of capital markets in shaping global business strategy, especially in times of turmoil? And I realize global events can occur suddenly and capital markets work best in the long term. However, US capital markets are impatient and really won't support activities in certain hotbed countries for a very long time. For example, there are probably only 10 US companies still operating in the Ukraine. And I was on the board of a global power generation company, as I mentioned before, that was in 22 different countries, many of which were considered hotspots and tough, undesirable areas from a geopolitical context. And essentially what happened is the capital markets just priced them out. That is, the funds became unavailable or only at a very high cost. The stock price suffered. So in a way, the capital markets, quote, solved the problem. It forced a rethinking and a shrinking of the global scope and exiting of some specific geographies perceived as being too high political risk. So to what extent do you see capital markets exerting their pressure in dealing with the current set of geopolitical risks? And what types of companies are more vulnerable than others in that kind of context?
Yeah, Sandy, I can always rely on you to put the hardest questions and some of the most complex questions, which demand a lot of nuance and thinking, right? So when one sort of looks into the role of capital markets, as you pointed out, capital markets, on the one hand, they force a degree of long-term, but capital markets inherently respond to momentum, and they are extremely, short-term in so many aspects. And so, they kind of do these things simultaneously. And there are so many elements of capital markets that I think Yeah, and I speak as as an amateur in terms of thinking about capital markets. There are experts, I'm sure, here on the call, who can speak much more wisely to this issue. But as I think about the role of capital markets, not as a capital markets expert, I find that capital markets are an extremely unreliable friend. They're a friend, but they're very, very unreliable. So if you think about what has driven capital markets here in the U.S. and elsewhere in the last decade, it's if you think about technology, that's been the primary driver of capital markets, and so much of it is the market betting on a future that they don't quite understand, but they basically are betting because everybody else is betting. And if I'm not at the betting table, then I'm going to be left behind. So that fear of missing out has pushed a massive amount of capital in a direction that the markets, I don't really believe that the markets, have seen the future, and that cycle just continues. So we saw a massive run up, at the start of this particular century. Then we saw lots of bounces, which is kind of natural as part of any kind of a cyclical process. Once we all became digital refugees in the pandemic, the market just exploded right out of the box, despite all the concerns and mistrust around digital technologies that were simultaneously boiling. But the capital markets just kept going in that direction. And now, of course, because of AI and all of that, we have yet another run on these issues as far as capital markets are concerned. So I think capital markets, of course, are a very important part of the disciplinary force. They are a very important part of our information gathering, because we need to be watching, where capital markets are pointing in order to at least do a little bit of reading of the tea leaves, but they are extremely unreliable. Now, if I think about a different direction where capital markets, may or may not be going, is in the context of the huge growing concerns about whether capital markets can be the most significant levers for both responding to the contextual elements, whether those are geopolitical elements or concerns around environmental risk or social inequalities, or risks just within companies themselves. And so it's a long-winded way of kind of using the term without using the term ESG. And as one thinks about ESG itself, one would have thought that this was a trend that would eventually become part of the decisions that investors, both investment managers and asset owners and consultants and others would adopt. You would think that this is something that potentially would get baked into regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks. Of course, it has done all of that. It has become a significant part of how investors approach the movement of capital, but it's now become this massive political hot potato, which sort of creates an entire geopolitical and pure political element of ESG, which has introduced politics into capital markets in a way that I don't recall, having seen in the recent past. So when we think about the anti-ESG backlash, it has become a significant part of the plank of the political right here in the United States. And it's also created what I would say is a transatlantic rift. The European Union, for instance, is much further along in terms of codifying ESG and setting regulations in place, whereas in the United States there just seems to be just like there's a political divide, there is a divide within the investor community as well. And many money managers in the U.S. are pulling back significantly when they're talking about these issues, and of course they are tiptoeing around these issues depending on whether they have business in red states or blue states. And so capital markets themselves have become extremely unreliable friends, and of course they are not friends that we can do without, because they are ultimately essential. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, other than to say that I see capital markets as a very, very important part of what contributes to our almost the dashboard that any advisor or any contextually intelligent player needs to have. But I do not believe that capital markets should be a clean signal that we use. So we need to bring our own thinking, our own reading, our own analysis to the table, and potentially temper the various signals that we read from that sector itself.
Okay, no, I think that's a good comment. That's not a clean signal, and we need to bring our own analysis to the table, because otherwise you could just be whipsawed if you responded to every particular change in capital markets. So thank you. But let's shift to what I was saying at the beginning of process, because I think that there's an appetite among our participants here to talk about what do we mean in terms of a potential shift of a board moving into more of an advisory role as opposed to one more focused, as we've seen in the recent past, on compliance. And also your point of contextual intelligence, and how does that play into an advisory role? And what does it mean? What are the skills and experience required for directors to play an advisory role and to have this contextual intelligence? And I guess a question embedded in it, and one in the chat, is, are there companies that are already doing it? Are there any examples of companies that you can think of that are playing more of an advisory role and bringing this contextual intelligence to bear? It may not be a specific company, but do you see European companies perhaps have moved more in this direction, or whatever? So any comments about talking about maybe how do you, if we think the needle's gone too far in the direction of compliance and we need to move it more to advice giving? I think under the general framework of what you were talking about, some of these issues are not new, but they are new in the degree of interconnectedness and the rapidity with which we're dealing with it. And the rapidity, we didn't talk about this, of technology, and technology coming from everywhere around the world. This is new to management teams, and it's new to boards, and it's new to individual directors. And so I think perhaps there's more of a need for advice giving that's always been part of a board role, but perhaps more suppressed as the pendulum swung, certainly in the early part of the century, to the compliance on a whole host of issues such as compensation, audit, finance, ESG to an extent. And maybe we need, since these are difficult new issues and ones, as you say, that are interconnected, maybe there's a need for advice giving. So how does is that right? How does the board step into that role? And that would be where the contextual intelligence in particular would come in. And how do boards get it? Board as a whole get it? How do individual members get it? And what kinds of skills are really required to be successful in bringing contextual intelligence to bear?
Yeah, great question again, Sandy. And I think where I would begin is going back to a comment I made earlier, and then what might seem like I'm reversing that comment, but you will see how I actually want to keep that comment in place and add to it. And the comment I made earlier was the market always wins. And if you are in any kind of a competitive situation and you're serving a community, and the community could be customers or it could be, a set of stakeholders for your organization, doesn't matter whether it's a for-profit or non-for-profit, there are always alternatives that your audience, has. And so there is always a market in which you participate. And whenever you're in a market, the need for an organization is, you need a set of competent executives who can carry out the business of the organization. And those competent executives need to be guided by those who have less of an executive function and can bring an outside perspective. And that, really is the role of a board. And over time, we have seen lots of issues and concerns about, whether boards have been doing their job in terms of providing that kind of external guidance and governance. And again, over time, there has been pressure on boards to take potentially a closer a more active role in bringing that outside perspective in. And a lot of that activity has translated into an expectation that boards will help the senior executive team comply with audit of financial issues, ethical issues, leadership questions, and so on and so forth. So this notion of compliance has become a very important role that boards can play and should play, and that has grown over the years. A second thing that has been very much on the radar, but we are so far away from getting to the ideal, is the representation on the board. There's been a lot of concern about essentially the clubbiness and the fact that boards are largely an extension of the executive team, and particularly the CEO or the senior leadership. And essentially, quite often they are there to reinforce, the decisions that the senior management is taking, rather than, providing a very different perspective, potentially, perspective from underrepresented minorities or underrepresented genders. And so there's been a growing concern about, bringing more representation of the board, and we are so far away from that. And the third, of course, is this, coming back to concerns around the climate impact, concerns around social impact, and of course, the whole question around, what's the role of the executive team and the board in providing proper governance and so on. So we're seeing all of these elements, playing a role in increasing demands on board members. So for each of that, we need board members who have deep, long years of experience. They bring wisdom. They bring an element of leadership in their own travels. And the way people become leaders is that they become specialists and they become experts in a certain domain. And once they become leaders of organizations, they're forced into a role of being able to rise above their specialization and then start connecting the dots across different arenas. And that sort of brings them to the job of being a board member. However, once you're on the board, they are assigned the job. You are in this committee or you're on that committee, because we need the boards to actually, do something rather than just meet. So, and this is really important, right, to those all of the committees. But the committee that we may not be creating on the boards is essentially this contextual committee, because we are drawing upon the finance expertise of this individual. We're drawing upon the strategic expertise of that individual. We're drawing upon the underrepresented perspective of this third individual who comes from, perhaps a minority community, or maybe the only woman on a board, full of men, and which are all really important things that we have done in terms of evolution of the board. But a victim of that whole process is the dot connecting expertise that so many board members have, simply because you're forced to do that as a leader of an organization. So how do we now, sort of think about that contextual committee that helps us, bring contextual intelligence to the senior executive team? And I come back to this notion of the market always wins. Ultimately, the senior executives are going to be responsible for delivering on their market responsibilities, and to ultimately they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, to their customers, their employees, to do well in whatever domain and whatever industry they're operating in. To win, to do well, to do a service to the community and society at large, every organization needs to realize that it's not just the market. There are all these non-market forces that you need to both adapt to, respond to, and anticipate. And that is part of what senior leadership of every company needs to be wise about, and needs to be prepared to make decisions on. And ultimately, I feel that senior management in a company, they really have to keep their noses close to the grindstone. So we need other wise people who can provide them some of those non-market elements. And this is where I think the board can play a really important role. And so what the board members can do is bring their dot connecting expertise, but also process all these different global forces that we're talking about, whether they're geopolitical forces, whether they're local political forces, whether they are issues that have to do with the changing state of the environment, and the changing state of democracy, and the social elements, or whether there's the changing state of technology. And of course, these days, we have also been made aware of the changing state of public health, and many of these other issues that affect us all. And I feel that we need to either create a role on every board, or every board member needs to sort of go through a series of conversations, and maybe this is almost a continuous education process that every board member needs to be a part of. Unfortunately, I speak from coming from higher ed. I think higher ed has done a complete disservice to today's leaders and to tomorrow's leaders. What we have done is we have taken all this complexity of the word, and we have essentially reformulated it in a way that's convenient for academics. So as an academic who's got a PhD in political science, I just do political science. I walk in the classroom, talk about political science. If I'm a PhD in nuclear physics, I just do nuclear physics. And so what you do is the university has taken business, stuck it in a business school, policy, stuck it in a policy school, law, stuck it in a law school, technology, you stuck it in between stuff, and mostly in engineering or business schools. And so you're training people to be narrow specialists, whereas the world really needs people who can be contextual thinkers as well. So unfortunately, when you're 25 years old or 28 years old, you really need that specialization in order to advance in life. And perhaps universities are doing some kind of a service in giving you those, those deep skills. But what we need to do is return to a place where the universities become comfortable at bringing all these different elements together, and really starting with the problems that organizations face. The problems could be, I am competing in a market, I have to be aware of the market forces, but I also need to bring appendices C, D, E, and F right to the front of the presentation. So how do I bring law, economics, business, technology, environment, nuclear physics, science, space, all that, back into people's thinking? And where do we do that? In the arts and science departments, or in the professional schools, or in the various graduate schools? And how do we bring that back into a frame of continuing education for people who are not 28 anymore, who might be 38, 48, 58, 68. People are living longer. Charlie Munger just died at the age of 99, and he could have gone on, had biology not taken on. Joe Biden is running for election, and he's more than 80 years old, for crying out loud. So continuing education is, I think, enormously important for every board member, but academic and universities need to step up to the plate. They need to educate themselves to make sure that their own expertise needs to be melded with the expertise of others. So I believe it's a joint responsibility. But ultimately, we all have to read our newspapers very carefully. We have to read in between the lines of the newspapers even more carefully, because unfortunately these days there's no shortage of news, there's no shortage of news sources, right. But what there is a shortage of our ability to read the news in context and our ability to use the news in our day-to-day lives.
Well, that's terrific. We've covered a lot of ground with this question, but let me follow up with a couple of questions, and then maybe we'll open this up to some other questions on the chat, although I'm trying to incorporate some of them in my own comments here. But just in terms of my own reaction, I think, to me, the contextual committee of the board is the board of the whole. It's not really possible to delegate anything that important to a committee. So I think we're really talking about the board as a whole. And for the board as a whole, I think to meet some of what your objectives and what you're talking about, you need to have people from diverse backgrounds, diverse in the original meaning of diverse, covering lots of areas, as you say, coming from different walks of life, whatever, and different experiences, different industries. And interestingly, I thought your comments on the characteristics of directors was very interesting, and I agree with it. But as we try to incorporate some diverse elements, such as underrepresented minorities or people that have digital expertise, digital natives, they're younger people oftentimes. They have not yet reached, let's say, leadership roles. And they've become, the whole world is siloed, not just the academic world, everything's siloed, and the need for specialization early on in your career to get ahead. So they come in with deep expertise, let's say in digital, but they are not able to fully grasp and comment and contribute to some broader issues that might come up, such as the geopolitical risks, because they've been focused, let's say, in a US-centric way. So these are some of the tensions in terms of putting together a board that has a lot of diversity to it in terms of what you were talking about of gender and underrepresented minorities, but also in terms of diverse global perspectives and different industry perspectives. So, but I've also found when I've brought some experts on board, either on the board itself or in an advisory capacity, they have the deep expertise, and let's say the issue the board's confronting is in that area of expertise. We've often found it was wrong. And when the expert left the room, the board, in its kind of contextual intelligence and plenary session, said, how much stock do we really put in this particular perspective? And so I'm wondering, since the world is changing so much and new things cropping up and new conflicts, how do you think about improving the quality of the information and the perspectives to kind of shift the signal noise ratio? Because there's just an awful lot of noise out there, and even the experts seem to be vulnerable to the noise. So how do you think about it? How should boards approach it, and what can be done to kind of improve that ratio?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Sandy. That in kind of on so many elements here, and one of the issues that I'd just like to pick up on is that we bring people on boards because they have demonstrated a degree of knowledge, expertise, and experience, and quite often that itself could be a trap. Where the entire board and often the management team is turning to that person for knowledge on technology here, right. And we've seen this happen over and over again, where the that expertise gets superseded by the reality of events. And the reality could be technological change, or it could be a conflict that breaks out, and then suddenly the reverberations of the conflict are, completely reverse, some of the received wisdom that one has got from, from the expert on the board. There are a few different ways to sort of think about this. I mean, one is to just acknowledge and be vulnerable, right? Which is that we all join boards because we believe, and our colleagues believe, that we bring a degree of expertise which is valuable to the collective. But be open and humble enough to acknowledge that the world is moving so fast in so many different directions, and there are so many interconnected elements that can cause change that could upturn much of the tea leaf reading that even this expert could bring to the table. So that acknowledgement is an important part of the process, because if we don't acknowledge that this could be a problem, then nobody's ever going to take steps towards it. The second thing is to as I mentioned, a journey of continuous learning. And that continuous learning does involve something that does on a day-to-day basis. And when I say day-to-day, it is, really keeping one's eyes and ears open, every time, you, not just read stuff in the mornings, but when you get on an airplane and you travel, just talk to the person in the seat next to you. Or even if you're in a car being driven from your airport to your hotel, so much of the time, and how many of us, and I'm doing this, just like I'm sure so many of us can relate to this. We've got our heads down on our phone, and we're looking at our, checking our email or whatever it is we're doing. It's really important stuff. But just look out of the car window, and you'll see a lot of context passing us by. And I've seen so many times, I've traveled with teams and boards, to countries far away from our home country. And so much of life is right around you, outside your car window, and everyone's got their heads down on their phones, simply because we feel that the entire world is in the palm of our hands. So I think it's really important to do something as simple as putting your head up and looking around. And the looking around could be staring out of a car window, or looking at something that might seem a little odd and out of place, and then asking the person sitting next to you, could be even the driver, gee, I just saw this, is this normal? Is this something that has happened just in the last few years? Or, you see some people on the street that look a little bit different from everybody on the street, and you kind of, again, turn to the person next to you and say, are these people from, I'm in Cartagena, Colombia, and these people look and they dress a little bit differently. And then you learn, well, they're not actually from Colombia, they're Venezuelan refugees who are on the street. Okay, then that starts me down the road of thinking, okay, here's something I need to learn more about the dynamics of, two really important countries in a continent that a large part of the time we, perhaps don't pay a lot of attention to. So it's almost little things like that. And then the third thing I would say is more formal ways of constantly learning and constantly, re-educating ourselves, and having that humility of, basically kind of saying, I always have something to learn. And the learning process is a multidimensional one. And one final thing I would add, because there's such a long list, is having people who have a different perspective, come and speak to you or visit them in their home locations. So sometimes it's more complicated, going and doing a site visit or a field visit. But you could certainly think about domains, organizations, people, institutions whose work is so different from the company that you're a part of, or the company that or the the home companies or the home organizations for the board members. And these organizations could be ones that are, potentially radical in the way they think. Potentially they're iconoclasts. Potentially you disagree with many aspects of what they do, but it just forces us to examine our assumptions. It forces us to rethink conventional wisdom. And even that process of then saying, okay, you know what, I have rethought my assumption and I feel now even more convinced of the point of view that I have, that's okay. But it's a way for us to test the logic that we have been, telling ourselves, and our official views of the world around us and the future, and making that more explicit, and potentially even opening up a debate among the board members. So as you said, Sandy, everybody should be part of the contextual committee. But when do we have an opportunity for board members to have a situation in front of them and say, okay, let's have an honest and open and friendly debate and potentially a disagreement without being disagreeable about this particular issue? And that particular issue could be a geopolitical question. It could be the role of technology. It could be, what do we do about climate action, or what do we do about the way young people think these days, and our consumer base is becoming younger than the demographics of senior management of the board, or any other issue.
No, I think this is all good. And I think that the wonderful opportunity for the board to have this kind of contextual conversation is a typical annual retreat meeting that's a couple of days long, in which you can talk about some of these global political issues. You can talk about, maybe some global trends. And I found it very useful to invite some outside people that have a different view than your company. Maybe it's a security analyst, maybe it's someone from Silicon Valley, let's say, in the venture capital space, who comes in and is willing to essentially go toe-to-toe with the CEO and have a conversation and a debate. And that has been really wonderful. And in fact, almost asking them to destroy my company. What would you do? Where are our vulnerabilities that you see it from an outside perspective? And also, too, when you have an opportunity for a multi-day meeting, is for the board to maybe visit a company, as you say, that's an iconoclast, but has some relevance for where they're going, and just go actually on site and meet with the management, but also do a factory tour, that kind of thing, or whatever, to get a sense as to what other people are doing and how that differs from what you're doing. So I think that's all good in terms of what I would think of opening the lens and rethinking your basic assumptions. And I also, just on a personal note.
I'm sorry, Sandy. Didn't mean to interrupt, but I just had one thought which I just wanted to add to. This is something that we do at Fletcher. I organize it every semester, and we call it Fletcher Reads the Newspaper. And so what we do is we take one major headline, that has been, coming back over and over again, front page, above the fold, in whatever form that you read the newspaper. And then you kind of say, okay, let's take this issue apart, and then also have a conversation about, what are the underlying drivers behind why this news story is hanging on for so long, and then what can be done about it. So some action associated with it. So what this does is actually an activity which is active. It's not just listening to an expert. Potentially, you can have an expert or somebody who can break some glass come in and shake up assumptions. But it gets people into a participant-centric mode where you can say, okay, let's use this opportunity to really understand what's going on, but also see if we have a constructive solution. So it is like a case study, but there's so many case studies that are coming at us day after day. So make it an active discussion, not just one where I go to a retreat, I listen to somebody interesting, and maybe I carry their book back with me, and then I kind of move on, right? So that's the only point I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think it's up to the board too to ask management to come back and say, okay, we've had this interesting conversation. Take that into account, and how would you change your strategy? Doesn't necessarily mean that they will change it, but what were the things that they would do differently, and what do you think the implications are? And maybe that is a better solution. So yes, I agree with you. I think that you have to be careful of just having these pie in the sky conversations without it coming down to some specific actions for companies. So I agree with that. I mean, I think it is the board's responsibility to kind of ask for follow-up to any of these kinds of different points of view, and how would that affect the company. I also like your idea of just talking to your driver. I always do that. I don't look at my phone. And I found in my consulting career that it's oftentimes hard to read those macro overall trends. But what's really useful is getting something granular. And then you can kind of bubble up from there. So instead of the top down, sometimes it's much easier to go from the bottom up. And in terms of you're connecting the dots, you start to see some dots at a very granular level that you have confidence in. This gets to the signal noise ratio. You have confidence in it because you've seen proof of it one way or another. And then you can bubble up to have a more macro view. So I think that's an important skill. And generally, I think you need to think deeply, and then you need to come back up and think more broadly. But I think connecting the dots at some granular level where it's connected to reality is really important. Just a final question, maybe for me, and then I think we've got maybe a little bit of time, and I'll turn it over to Ellen in terms of questions coming in on the chat. And that is, going back, you have an advantage of being an academic and seeing lots of different situations and companies and boards. Is anyone who's doing this well, or even if there's not a specific kind of exemplar, what are the attributes that of boards that would do this well?
Yeah.
What
So
are their practices or their skills that they have on the board?
Yeah, so you had asked me that question earlier, and I didn't give you a response as I was sort of thinking about whether to call out individual companies for good behavior or not. So let me just sort of give a couple of examples. Perhaps not necessarily naming individual companies,
Right.
but just sort of thinking about how companies and organizations are approaching these issues. I think let's take the example of the social media companies as just a sort of one one category of companies, social media tech companies, because in some ways they are almost at the crossroads of many of these issues. They are part of a product and a company that is global. They are located, usually they're headquartered in a single country, mostly in the United States. When we think about the large tech companies and even the fast moving tech companies, and they need to recognize that any single tweak in their product could have reverberations in parts of the world that are very, very far away from where they are. And a large part of the mistake that the big social media companies, let's take the example of Meta, formerly known as Facebook, made was they didn't realize how powerful their product could be in so many different domains. They, of course, had a vision for this being an ultimate connector, but when one ultimately connects billions and billions of people, you also ultimately connect many different issues. And you connect people from places so far away from your own zone of experience and expertise that you can't even see, the so-called the butterfly effect of a small change that you make in your code, which then leads to the possibility that there's ethnic cleansing in a country whose even name I may not know. Sitting in a beautiful glass office in Silicon Valley. What I feel, and in addition to that, when you think about a company like, and again, I don't want to call out a single company, but any of these tech companies, they are by design and by nature often led by extremely young executives who are the founders. They are the moving force behind this, and understandably, they are extremely hyper focused. So their experience base is narrow. They are deep experts in a very narrow space. So they really need that breadth of wider perspective, and that breadth of wider perspective, should be not just geographic, but also sort of brings all these outside elements, such as, what's the impact on society, what's the impact on different political systems, what do we do about, who's responsible for the content that kind of goes through your systems, and what's the dividing line between First Amendment rights and your responsibility to guard content around the world. How do we think about the fact that regulations and cultural mores and even political systems are different in different parts of the world? Different in Europe, they're different in North America, they're different in India, they're different in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but you have the same product that is going everywhere. So that's borderless. So how do you create something that is borderless and at the same time respectful of all these different divisions? And sometimes being respectful in one jurisdiction is actually disrespecting some other jurisdiction. So what could be considered complying with government regulations in one part of the world is going against the basic ethical principles in some other part of the world, where freedom of expression and First Amendment rights and so on and so forth are paramount. So how do we sort of think about all of that? What I've found is companies that recognize these tensions and these differences, the CEO most significantly, and others in the leadership team, they feel that they need this outside experience, and they feel comfortable enough, secure enough in their own capacities to be able to bring in people who can not only advise and bring in those external signals, but also potentially challenge the decisions that they are considering and provide added perspective. And that source of challenge comes from bringing people on board who are from very, very different domains. They are not necessarily from technology. They're not necessarily from one of the adjacent industries, but they bring a geographic breadth. They bring breadth from a different community, and potentially could also be troublemakers in that decision-making process. So I accept troublemaking as a necessary part of making the choice. Now, I'll say one more thing, which is the example of, sorry.
We need to wrap up. We're getting close to time, and I need to turn the program over to Alan for some concluding comments. But what you've been saying is just underlying the value of diversity of perspectives and experience. But I didn't mean to cut you quite so quick, but we're almost at 9 o'clock. Did you want to just say a few more words? Are you okay?
Yeah, so the only point that I wanted to add here is that we keep, we've been talking about a board that does this. Quite often some organizations have resorted to some specialized groups, which provide added perspective. So coming back to the example of Meta, they have a sort of a so-called Supreme Court that helps adjudicate on, what content should go on their platform or not. So there could be opportunities for different organizations to come up with some more specialized, sub-boards that take on, some part of this big surface area called context, and create a few specialized zones, as long as they use them in a responsible way, and as long as that's not window dressing, and as long as senior management actually is committed to taking that input and integrating that into their practice. That's all.
Yeah, no, they need to come together. And also too, with changing technology, we've got a comment in chat, but there's an opportunity to apply game theory and some other things too that can enhance the experience and decision making of the group of a whole. Ellen, I turn this over to you for concluding comments. I hope I captured a lot of the questions on chat, and I apologize to those whom I didn't capture their question. Go ahead, Ellen.
All right. Well, Sandy and Bhaskar, this was an incredible conversation, and truly appreciate both of you taking your time out of your very busy schedules. Few quick announcements, and then before you head on your way, our program calendar for National Association of Corporate Directors New England chapter is scheduled through June, and we hope you will join us at one or more of our upcoming events. January 16th, we have a virtual program being held jointly with our Philadelphia chapter. It's called Hot Topics for the upcoming 2024 proxy season. Then on January 30th, we're going to host Hot Topics for private company directors and how they're focusing their time. We also would ask that you put on your calendars, we have 2-day-long programs that are set. On April 11th, we have a program for people who are aspiring public company directors. So if you're on private boards and you're thinking of trying to get on public boards, this is a great all-day program. And then on June 13th, we do a curated program all day for sitting public company directors. You need to be a sitting public company director to be in that room. It's a full-day program on advanced topics in corporate governance. Please visit our website for a complete list of our upcoming events, since we have events January through June already set every month, most months 2 different events. And please, finally, don't forget the survey. The survey is very important because it helps us prioritize and think about what people need. So thank you, everyone, for attending. We look forward to seeing you at future programs. And thank you again, Bhaskar, Sandy. Just an amazing conversation.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you all. And thanks to our audience and participants.
Thank you, Ellen, and the entire team at NACD. And Sandy, thank you so much for your gentle questioning and your patience with my long-winded answers. And I really appreciate all the questions and comments from the audience that we didn't get to. And do feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to engage with you on any of these questions.
Well, thank you, Bhaskar, for your thoughtfulness and also your kind offer. So it's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Have a good rest of the day,
Yes,
everybody.
you too. Bye-bye.